So let us begin. On behalf of New York Law School and Dean Anthony Crowell, I welcome you to the first virtual CityLaw Breakfast and the 168th in the series that began in 1994. I am Ross Sandler, Professor of Law and the Director of the Center for New York City Law. We are happy that so many people are attending this breakfast. More than 400 people signed up, far more than we could have accommodated at the law school's event center. So there is some virtue to having this as a Zoom breakfast. I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. I wish to also thank all the generous and loyal sponsors of the CityLaw Breakfast series that have been with us for so long. Consolidated Edison, Verizon, the law firm of Greenberg Traurig, and the many Gold Star individual contributors who contribute at each of the breakfasts. Today's speaker is Polly Trottenberg, Commissioner of the city's Department of Transportation, and she will speak on COVID-19 and DOT's response to the pandemic. Following her prepared talk, Commissioner Trottenberg will take questions and comments from the audience. So in order for you to submit a question or comment, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. You may submit a question or comment at any time during the presentation. Please identify yourself with your first and last name and organization so everyone can know who has submitted the question or comment. Questions and comments not reached during the Q&A period will be submitted to the Commissioner following the breakfast. Again, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen to submit a question or comment. Commissioner Trottenberg was appointed the City DOT Commissioner in 2014. Before coming to that post, she had an extensive federal transportation career. Commissioner Trottenberg held high positions for 4 years at federal DOT, and prior to that had worked for 12 years on Capitol Hill at various times for Senator Schumer, Senator Moynihan, and Senator Boxer. As DOT Commissioner Trottenberg has had a major role in the Vision Zero program, the expansion of bus lanes, the expansion of bike lanes, the plans for the BQE and other major construction projects, and most recently during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Open Streets and Open Restaurants program. We're delighted to welcome back Commissioner Trottenberg to New York Law School's virtual City Law podium. I give it now to Commissioner Trottenberg. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Ross. And thanks to New York Law School and to you, and of course to beloved Alice, who I know is here as well. It is great to be here, albeit virtually. And I've certainly seen, looked at the attendance list, and I know I see a lot of friends and colleagues in the audience. And sorry we're not all together in a room, but we'll do our best to have a good virtual experience. I want to sort of speak quickly, and I'm hoping now someone will put my presentation up on the screen. I'm going to sort of run through quickly, I think, some of the experiences and observations we have had so far in this, extraordinary 4.5 months that has been the COVID-19 pandemic. But I really also want to get to questions. I know about these events. We always get fantastic questions. So, whoops, already jumping here. All right, so sort of a quick summary of what I want to speak about. And again, I know we have lots of experts in the audience, but just to level set, we'll do a little reminding everybody, New York City DOT, what we do and we don't do. We'll go to the next slide. Actually, next slide. Thanks, Julie. Just to sort of remind folks, most people know we're not actually the agency that runs the subways, although we do a lot of work jointly with the MTA on bus service and a lot of things, but we're the agency that runs the streets, the sidewalks, as Ross mentioned, builds out the bike network, bus lane network. We run the Staten Island Ferry and a lot, 800 bridges, and then a lot of the street infrastructure, lights, signals, etc. Next slide. And, just to talk a bit about, it's funny, you read sometimes in the papers that are sort of jokingly the before times, pre-COVID and the now times. We'll talk a little bit about the before times, and a lot of these trends, I think this expert audience is aware of. New York City was experiencing unprecedented growth, population growth, job growth, tourism growth, tremendous trends. And it was certainly impacting our transportation system. Traffic had slowed, a lot of congestion, Subway ridership had grown for many years, but actually had been starting to taper off the pre-COVID, ditto bus ridership declining. But, in general, we were a growing, bustling city, and the challenge we faced on the transportation front was, how do we accommodate that growth? How do we accommodate it safely? How do we accommodate it in an environmentally sustainable manner? And how do we find the resources to do that? So next slide. And, while we were sort of looking at those traditional modes, a lot of you know, and I'm sure we'll talk about today, obviously, all the sort of new technologies that are coming on the transportation front. Uber and Lyft, bike share, scooters, Revel, all kinds of, what is now called micro-mobility, that we're growing in the city, but having some ups and downs, or in the case of scooters, just, legalized by the state and the city council recently. So, sort of interesting pieces of the puzzle, and certainly something we'll talk about in the course of this day. Next slide. But now let's look what's happened during COVID. And I think probably a lot of you have followed these trends, but this chart I think is very helpful to kind of visualize it. If you start right, basically that end of that first, second week in March, we sort of level set what in DOT, are sort of our main modes we're looking at here: vehicle traffic, subway ridership, bus ridership, and city bike. And, not surprisingly, as we went into that, really that initial period of sheltering in place and doing everything we could to minimize contact and exposure, all modes plummeted. But, sort of some plummeted more than others. And I think you can see over time, everything started to go back up. City bike has now obviously gone further than where it was pre-pandemic, and that's not surprising. It has been, a wonderfully popular mode, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later in the presentation, but I want to thank my own folks at DOT and the folks at Lyft. I think we've done a great job this summer in keeping that service up and running and safe, and continuing to expand it. You can see subway and bus starting to come back up slowly, still nowhere near pre-pandemic levels, and want to compliment the MTA. They too have done a tremendous job in keeping the system clean and operating, and it's been heroic work by the men and women there. And then you can see traffic, and we'll talk about that. Plummeted and is now back almost to where it was pre-pandemic. It has actually leveled off in the past few weeks, but another trend we're certainly looking. So let's go to the next slide. Next, skip that one. So I want to talk a little bit just quickly about what were the big priorities, not only sort of on DOT's plate, but really that the city was talking about, that the city council was interested in, that very much, I think, pointed to, what people were viewing as the future of transportation in New York City. A lot of you are probably familiar with the bill passed by the city council, the Transportation Master Plan, very much the priority for Speaker Corey Johnson, and, pretty breathtaking in its ambition. Sort of on par to saying New York is, I wouldn't say it would quite turn us into Copenhagen, but would get us a fair way there. And so if we go to the next slide, you can see some of the targets. These would be enormous targets for the agency to meet. This is a dramatic, acceleration of the pace. And I have to say, I think I'll say this about Mayor de Blasio, he doesn't get the credit I think he deserves for how much we have picked up the pace of bike lane installation, bus lane installation. We've done a lot of work, but the master plan was going to call on us to do it at an even more dramatic pace. Now, the price tag on the master plan was going to be almost $2 billion to be spent over a period of next 5 to 10 years. So we'll sort of talk about now where the city stands from a fiscal point of view. But to do all this work was certainly going to have to cost some resources. So we'll go to the next slide. Sorry, yeah, there we go. We had also last year, prior to the master plan, a lot of unfortunately, we had a lot of cyclist fatalities last summer, very tragic. And so we had also put together what we called the Green Wave, which was, I think, a very ambitious effort to continue the work that the city had been doing to build a completely protected bike lane network. And we put out for the first time, and you can see it on this map, what the sort of fully fleshed out network would look like. And we committed to do that over basically the next 10 years. And you can see, if you sort of see those gray areas, we call those bike priority districts, particularly areas where we're seeing cycling on the rise, sort of the next tier out from the center of the city and the inner parts of Brooklyn and Queens, where we're seeing cycling on the rise, but unfortunately seeing a lot of crashes, injuries, and fatalities, and a huge need for more bike infrastructure. So you can sort of see here from this map, what the plan looks like for the next 10 years. Next slide. Likewise, and I'm going to talk about buses pre-COVID and post-COVID, because pre-COVID, there was certainly a recognition that the city wanted to do more. This is, again, very much in conjunction with New York City Transit to improve bus service. To build out more dedicated bus lanes for the MTA, to continue with improving the fare collection technology, the routes, the things they need to do to improve bus service. Both agencies came together with an advisory group that included, I think, a lot of the stakeholders in this area. The city officials, elected officials, advocates, social justice groups, the transit unions, because, folks sort of say, look, we need to build, dozens and dozens of miles of bus lanes. They can be very challenging to implement, particularly local businesses, often have pretty strong opposition to them. So, we tried to put together a working group, I think, of all the stakeholders to see how, our agency and the MTA working together could do a better job of designing the routes, of making sure we were working closely with local businesses, because we really do, as a city, need to do more on bus service. Next slide. And just, Ross mentioned Vision Zero, just to also talk a bit about, meanwhile, we have been in New York City DOT doing well over 100 Vision Zero safety improvement projects every year. Here's sort of an iconic one. In a, sort of a tucked away part of the city, Garrettson Beach, where there was it was sort of a residential area, but it had this enormously wide avenue, which had sort of become a place notorious for drag racing, for tragic crashes, and several fatalities in recent years. And you can see here how we sort of transformed the street. And it was quite controversial, believe me. But we have now, knock on wood, seen a dramatic improvement in the safety profile of the street. And we've continued to do hundreds of projects like that all over the city in all 5 boroughs. Next slide. Okay, then we come to COVID. So we're sort of in the midst of all that work when COVID hits. And obviously, like a lot of parts of city government, we went into, big parts of our operation kind of went into pause. Some parts didn't. Staten Island Ferry, emergency work, some parts of what DOT did kept working all summer long. And I want to take a minute here to thank all the men and women of not only my agency and the MTA, but throughout city government, who were out all summer long. Sometimes it was, particularly early on, very frightening to do so, and continued to serve the city pretty heroically. But, for some of our operations, we went into more of an emergency mode for some number of weeks while we, made sure our employees were safe, helped flatten the curve, and figured out how to retool all our operations, because we needed to completely transform the way we did a lot of our work. Sanitizing equipment, masks, staggering shifts, having, people not travel together in vehicles and not cluster at work sites. I think for all the operational agencies, it took some time to really figure out how to make sure we were doing things safely. And, our employees were a great source of, input, and as were the unions. We really had a good partnership with them, at the ferry and throughout our operational divisions to help think through with their health and safety experts how we keep everybody safe. And while we sort of started to retool through that, we also took the opportunity, as a lot of cities have, but I'm proud of what we've done here in New York, to take a fresh look at the streets. And if you remember from the chart I showed earlier, sort of early on in the pandemic, traffic plummeted, and we can all remember it. The streets were pretty empty, and it was, a lot of people said to me, "Oh, it's so quiet, it's so marvelous." And so, we started to hear from people like, let's, how can we open up these streets? Particularly there was a time when the playgrounds were closed. It didn't look like, maybe beaches and pools and summer camps would be open, and there was a hunger to sort of have some open space. So we'll go to the next slide. So the first program we rolled out, and we sort of rolled it out early May, very much in conjunction with the city council, which, to their credit, pushed us to come up with a kind of lighter touch model than what the city had done traditionally, which was, often having NYPD man the barricades, and it was very labor intensive. So we came up with a much lighter touch model, and you can see from this map, tried to get into all 5 boroughs, got about 74 miles opened up, and I'll talk a bit about the different flavors of that. But, really turn these streets into places where people could recreate. I will say near me, I saw it did become a place for kids, were learning how to ride bikes. And we really tried to make it a collaborative effort and not just sort of an NYPD heavy exercise. Next slide. Part of what we did with those open streets was bike lanes. The city now has a 1,300-mile bike lane network. About a third of that is protected bike lanes. But certainly after the tragic bike fatalities, what we saw last year, there's been a collective desire to really accelerate the pace of protected bike lanes. And so, those projects can often take a while. Like bus lane projects, they can be controversial. They can wind up in lawsuits, and you want to get the design work right. But this summer, I think we're very nimble, and we started to put a lot of these bike lanes in, in sort of a temporary status, get them up and running, and we'll show, actually, if you go to the next slide, we'll show you the list. The ones that have already been installed and the ones that are coming. And, our focus, if you look at the ones that are installed, is again, trying to look at key connectors and key spines, connecting people to the East River bridges, looking at places where we can connect to healthcare facilities, for essential workers. So trying to make the most of, where we put in those bike lanes. And people say, well, why did you make them temporary? It just, one thing folks may not know, we have requirements under the city council that if we install bicycle infrastructure, we're required to notify them, and there's a certain time period and process that has to be done with the community board. So, some of these now we're in the process of working with the community boards to make permanent, and certainly our hope that they will wind up being that way, as soon as we can work through the process. I'll just give one sort of interesting, perhaps not known fact about bike lanes. Some of you have probably followed this summer. The mayor has very much loosened up, the alternate side restrictions, to some praise and some criticism. But just one interesting operational challenge for us is typically we do our bike lane work in a lot of places on the days when you have street sweeping, because it cleared out all the cars, and it makes it much easier for us to get in and do our work and not have to tow a lot of vehicles. Because we've had very little street sweeping this summer. It has actually been sort of an operational challenge for us to get in, because again, we don't want to tow a lot of cars if we don't have to. So next slide. I had mentioned City Bike earlier in the discussion, and again, I do want to take a minute to just sing their praises, and Lyft has been a really good partner. They have made a big investment commitment, which they are honoring. We have been installing bike infrastructure this summer at a terrific pace, particularly getting up into northern Manhattan, the South Bronx. We've worked in partnership with them to provide year-long free memberships to healthcare workers and frontline workers. And as you saw from the ridership charts, their ridership has grown dramatically, and they have really become, they always were, but an ever more important part of the city's transportation network. Next slide. And then, as I had mentioned, the city had very ambitious, plans to build out more of the bus network, but the mayor announced in June that we would basically jumpstart 9 projects, and you can see them here on the map. And I will say that, in some places, the jumpstarting of the projects has been met with great enthusiasm, and they're underway. In some places, we're, already running into quite a bit of opposition and resistance. So, bus lane projects, it's, we're doing everything we can to speed them up, but they do, often require, some amount of work with communities and local businesses and elected officials. But you can see here the focus, particularly on these projects, places again where, bus ridership is heavy, neighborhoods where we see essential workers, COVID impacted neighborhoods, places where we see really essential bus service. Next slide. I'll kind of close with, I think, what has become of late, sort of a big area of interest. The city took a big leap, and I won't lie, it's been a scary ride, to sort of say, we're going to let, any restaurant in New York City that wants to and is eligible take the sidewalk space and the curb space in front of their restaurant and use it to serve. And, obviously having to follow some rules and requirements. We have had at this point over 9,400 restaurants apply. And I think any of you have walked around the city, you have seen, the restaurants, I think, creating some beautiful outdoor space and trying to serve folks and, most importantly, I think, put people back to work. I think a lot of you know the restaurant sector is actually one of the largest in the city economy. They're the largest payers of sales tax, and obviously in major employers who employ New Yorkers from all walks of life. And, it's a sector that, I think in particular the mayor really cares deeply about and has been enthusiastic to see what we can do to help. And just go to the next slide. In addition to letting restaurants have that space in front, we've also tried, sort of, I think in what people would say was kind of the more European mode for the long weekends, close off whole streets and really let restaurants spread out and let patrons come. We've now got 47 of these, what we're calling open streets restaurants, and that can be multiple restaurants. People have loved it. It's had its challenges. Some of you have seen the press, we've in some cases had young people exuberantly over congregating, and, look, enforcement is sort of, while you're trying to have a light touch and help the restaurants get up and running, there has been an enforcement component also for the city and the state, in cases where we want to just make sure things are safe. Next slide. I just sort of want to, I think I'm going to close with 2 slides, talk a bit about the budget, and then I think the questions for us going forward, and I know the questions that this audience will want to discuss. I think people say, what are some of the challenges you faced this summer? And obviously worrying about the health and safety of my workforce has probably been the top of my list. My agency has lost people to COVID, as have, all other big city agencies, and of course the MTA, and keeping employees safe. And that has been, I think, the most challenging and difficult part of the summer. But, in addition to all that, my agency, we've had all these unprecedented new demands on us, and we are facing, a serious budget climate. And I think that has potentially been sort of hard for oftentimes, I think, regular New Yorkers and elected officials and others to fully grasp, because the budget in New York City grew for 10 years in a row. And in the 6 years prior to this year that I was commissioner, my budget grew every year. My agency headcount grew by 1,000 people. And it, really enabled us, any new priority or initiative or request that, an elected official or anyone might have, we were sort of often able to throw, some resources and some personnel at it. But we're in a very different fiscal climate now, unfortunately. Just, a little bit about my agency, we are seeing, I have a $1.1 billion operating budget and, some pretty big reductions. And that, just to be clear, that maybe that to some will say, well, that doesn't sound so big. But, remember, for any city agency, a certain amount of the cost of that expense budget are fixed, rent and personnel. It's harder than it looks to make those kind of reductions, particularly, to honor what the mayor has charged us all to do, which is, of course, avoid layoffs as best we can. Likewise, in our capital budget, the city has not yet, I think, sort of made the final decisions about what the capital budget is going to look like in the coming years. But certainly, we are taking a hard look at all our projects and seeing potentially where things can be pushed to the out years. We're going to see some real challenges there as well. And now, there is, I think, for my agency, it's not only going to be a hiring freeze. Our headcount is going to go down. We were at almost 6,000 employees, and that number is going to go down. And so just, I think when people sort of, I all these articles written like, city government, here are 15 more things you should do. And I think sort of my rejoinder to that is, it's fine if there are new things we should be doing and new priorities, but sort of to do that now in an intellectually honest way, you also have to say, well, then what are the things we're going to let go of or delay or put on the back burner? We can't keep adding new things to the list without, I think, taking stock of, how we reprioritize. The final slide, I'll just close with, just sort of some bigger thoughts, and then obviously I want to hear from the audience. I mean, I will say, we did some transformational things in lightning speed. Some of it we got right, some of it, certainly some lessons learned along the way. I certainly want to thank the mayor for his leadership. I also want to thank the advocacy community and the city council, who along the way often pushed us. sometimes in ways that were a little uncomfortable, but I think really helped us do some bold things. And meanwhile, as I pointed out, my agency has continued to do our bread and butter work. Men and women have been out operating the Staten Island Ferry 24/7. Those of you who've seen our roadway crews have been out fixing streets, ped ramps, continuing to make our city more accessible. So all that work continues even as we're trying to do all this new transformational work. And again, just as we face a very uncertain fiscal climate. So, thank you all for hearing me. And again, I think, for all of us, no matter what we do in our lives, this period of time has been profound. And it has certainly been profound in city government in some painful and challenging ways, but in some new and exciting ways. So, with that, thank you. Thanks, Ross. Happy to take questions.
Good. Let me step in. You put me on video, please, Brian, the host. I'm not on video. So I'll start anyway. We're going to have questions, but I want to ask the first question. And that is, we live in Greenwich Village, and there's not all that much parking. A lot of it is truck zones and other zones, but since the open restaurants started, the restaurants have taken over the parking lanes and the curb lanes and have done terrific. They look wonderful, and I would just wonder, what are your plans to evaluate that and to make that sort of use of the parking lane permanent? I'm thinking about the bike lanes. You're doing experiments there. You're finding where you can do that. I hope that you're finding, if you have not 9,500 parking spaces in restaurants, but maybe 5,000.
Well, right, and I want to be clear about that 9,400. That's who's applied. Not everyone is necessarily, yet outdoors, and not all of them are in the curb lane. So it's not 95. I think it is about half that are taking part of the curb lane. We are certainly getting those questions. Believe me, I have been out all over the city, and everywhere I go, I talk to restaurateurs, and of course, for all of them, they want to make it permanent. They feel like it is sort of saving their businesses. It's enabling them to employ folks. But I will also say, it's been a big leap of faith for the city to do this, and we really have had to learn along the way. Particularly, one thing I know probably you've heard of, a lot of restaurants kind of went into the street. We'd given pretty detailed guidelines about how to do it safely, and a lot of them kind of didn't understand how to do it, and we really had to scramble and go back and make sure that those setups are safe and will protect patrons. I think this is a question we're going to have to grapple with. To continue those setups in the winter, it could help the restaurants. How would you handle heating? It's interesting. Some of you may have seen in the New York Times yesterday. In France, they have decided to ban outdoor heating for their cafes as an environmental measure, because it takes a lot of energy to heat an outdoor space in the wintertime. So I think thinking about sort of the safety and the environmental impacts of massive outdoor heating everywhere, how we would handle snow removal, I think there's sort of some practical operational questions. But I also know that the restaurants are, keenly supportive of being able to continue to do this. And so, I think that's certainly we will be evaluating as we go along, and the discussion will unfold.
Okay, let's turn it over to Brian Kasuba, who's been collecting the questions and comments from the audience. And Brian, why don't you start with the first of the questions or comments that you have?
Sure, thank you. And just so everyone knows, we have about 225 people in the room, so thank you all for coming. And if for some reason you missed the beginning of the presentation for being able to log in late, we are videoing the entire breakfast, and that will be available tomorrow morning. You should receive an email. If not, it'll be on our citylandnyc.org website. So if you missed any of this or you want to see it again, please look there for the video afterwards. So we have a bunch of questions, and we'll get right into it. The first question is from Shawl Picker. Shawl Picker, a student from Macaulay Honors College at Hunter College, an urban studies major. Will the DOT install pop-up bus lanes using traffic cones like what was done in Boston to speed up bus service in order to encourage social distancing and reduce operating costs?
Well, I think as you saw, I put up on that slide some of the bus lanes we're looking to install. We have tried to do some sort of pop-up treatments. On the New York streets, I have to say, they tend to get knocked over in a New York minute, and it becomes very labor intensive. So I think you really want to have a design that is durable. But I don't think the challenge is, sort of pop-up versus non-pop-up. I think, at least in New York, the challenge is to get a design that works for all the users of the street. That, Ross mentioned things like making sure you have loading zones for local businesses, that you've worked through, the safety measures, that you've worked with sort of the local institutions and businesses on the street. But again, we committed this summer to putting up 20 miles of bus lanes in really the next few months, which is a very, very ambitious goal. And we're working our way through it. I was yesterday with a group of stakeholders up on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. I will be this afternoon out in Flushing, Queens, Main Street, looking at the project we're looking to do there.
Okay, great. Next question is from Peter Cohen, Transportation Research Forum. He says, in January, the BQE panel appointed by the mayor recommended starting emergency repairs to the 1.5-mile section under the Brooklyn Heights Promenade. Overweight trucks, estimated to be at least 11% of those using the highway, would also have to be prohibited as they are accelerating the deterioration of the highway. Can you advise what steps have been taken to start these emergency repairs and effectively discourage overweight trucks?
So we have started to do some of that emergency work, and more will be coming. And we're going to sort of, I think, shortly be laying out the schedule for some of that. When we, and again, thanks to Ross, and he was part of the BQE panel, and it showed, showed some terrific leadership and helped us think through some of these challenges. And, we did see that overweight trucks were a real factor on the BQE. We started working with NYPD to do a real enforcement blitz. Actually, it had a pretty good effect. I mean, I have to say, when PD started going out there and pulling trucks over and enforcing, we saw a real reduction in overweight trucks. We were on sort of a parallel track, also working with some of the local elected representatives up in Albany to see if we could get the authority for automated truck weight enforcement. The city can't do that without legislative authority from Albany. We were kind of starting to work on that when coronavirus hit, and obviously legislative business up in Albany got a bit scrambled. We are, again, having those discussions, and there has already been a bill introduced, and that is certainly high on our list of, I think, next steps. There aren't actually many jurisdictions in the United States that have, fully leaned into automated truck weight enforcement. A couple have done pilot projects on it, but I think it's something where we really want to be a leader.
Okay. Next question is from Andrea Feller. The tremendous focus on bicycling completely leaves out seniors and the disabled, as many others, for various reasons. And it might seem appealing in the summer, but much less in the winter and, of course, when it rains. Why does the city not consider light rail?
Okay. Well, I'll answer. I want to talk a second about the bikes, and then I'll get into the light rail question. And it's funny because I'm certainly not one to say cycling is for everybody everywhere at all times of year. And of course, people have disabilities or very long distances to travel, or it's freezing cold. Bikes may not be, the mode they choose. That said, cycling in New York City has the popularity has grown almost by double digits for years on end. So, particularly I'd say for the younger generations, it is an increasingly popular mode of travel. And look, I'm someone, I bike in the winter sometimes too. It's cold, but there is a group of people that bike all year round, and that group is growing. So I think it is important that the city, continue to encourage and facilitate and foster that growth. I mean, cycling is, it's a environmentally friendly mode of transportation. It's an affordable mode of transportation. Very much, I think, enhances our city. I recognize I hear from a lot of seniors as I travel around the city, their anxieties about cyclists not following the rules. And, we certainly work closely with different cycling advocacy groups to remember to do that education, because we all need to share the roads. But I think one thing I will always remind folks of, in all my years of DOT commissioner, we have had a few tragic incidents where a pedestrian has been killed by someone on a bike, but we have had tragically hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of incidents where pedestrians have been killed by cars. So if you sort of look at the relevant dangers, you are still, you are much more in danger of being hurt or injured or killed by a car. On the question of light rail, some in this audience may know that the city actually did put forward potentially a light rail proposal called the BQX to run along the Brooklyn-Queens waterfront, to very much get at the challenge of a subway system that was designed to filter people from the outer boroughs into the central core of Manhattan and doesn't have good interborough connections. And, as the city has changed and employment and growth has happened so much in the outer boroughs, particularly along the Brooklyn-Queens waterfront, we very much recognized that there was a need for better transit connections there. That said, the BQX, I would say, is a project that has had quite a lot of controversy and, not insignificant in terms of costs, and something I think at the moment as the city grapples with its fiscal picture, we're sort of, I don't know that we're ready to proceed right at this moment, but I agree that I think in the long run, as the city and the MTA get on better fiscal footing, there is a real important role for light rail, and it's certainly something the city should look at. I would say just in general on that topic, I get a lot of questions about why aren't we more like London and Paris, where we're turning more and more of the streets over to cycling, and we are trying to do that. But one thing I like to remind folks is one of the advantages that some of the major European cities had is they have been making tremendous investments in expanding their mass transit systems. And that has very much helped that transition, getting people out of their cars. Here in New York, other than what we did for the Second Avenue subway, adding a few stops, and then over to the west side, to Hudson Yards, we've done, basically no capacity additions to our subway system, even as we know from the growth, we've seen subway ridership, not at this moment, but, in the past 20 years grow dramatically. So, we need to make those mass transit investments to sort of, continue the transformation of the city into one that is far less auto dependent.
Okay, next question. From Ellie Bilms. You mentioned opposition from local business owners as an obstacle to implementing more bus and bike lanes. Don't we have strong evidence from across the city that street improvements actually benefit businesses? And shouldn't a shorter commute for tens of thousands of bus riders outweigh someone's preference for being able to park directly in front of their business?
Yeah, I would say this, there is certainly evidence that in places where we build bus lanes and bike lanes, at the very least, sort of the economics of businesses is not harmed, in some cases enhanced. But I would also say, to be fair to the local businesses, and by the way, and the elected officials who support them. I mentioned that I am going out to Flushing this afternoon. The local business improvement district out there did a survey of the local businesses. They were unanimous in their opposition to the project. They are planning on doing a demonstration in opposition today. So, I just think people need to be a little realistic that the opposition to these projects can be very, very passionate. And, it's not to say that we don't go ahead with these projects, but I think we also want to work with the local businesses. And part of this is a climate, and this was even pre-COVID. Post-COVID, I think it's going to be an even bigger challenge. But pre-COVID, even small businesses were struggling in New York. I think, bricks and mortar businesses were struggling. More and more business was becoming e-commerce. Rents were remaining very high. So I think you have to sort of contextualize a little bit. For a lot of small businesses, things felt existential before COVID. And, look, in some cases where they may be blaming bus lanes or bike lanes, and maybe those weren't necessarily the culprits, some of that could be true. But I don't want to discount, I think the struggles of small businesses in the cities, of restaurants, some of these particularly, struggling entrepreneurs who put their heart and soul and their life savings into their businesses. So I don't want to be cavalier about, how they feel. And again, we try and work closely with them. 14th Street's a great example where there was a lot of concern from local businesses. We took a lot of time. I think, the project has proved very, very successful. But, in the spirit of honesty, if you go and you look, Sam Schwartz, for example, has done, sort of regular reports. If you go and you look at the surveys of the businesses, some say it's gotten better, some say no change, and some numbers say business has gotten worse. Again, pre-COVID. Now in a post-COVID world, I think businesses are struggling even more. And so just navigating those conflicts. It sounds easy to sort of say, but when you're in the middle of it, it can be very challenging.
Okay. To follow up on that, given the COVID trends, this is from Adriana Espinoza, given the COVID trends you shared, it seems folks are feeling more and more comfortable with cycling. Does DOT have a projection of how many New Yorkers may start biking to and from work as the city reopens? And what are DOT plans to accommodate this shift as it's related to bike parking?
Good question, Adriana. I think if you look at the trend line that we're seeing, I think generally, and actually, if you remember those trend lines I showed on that earlier slide, biking is actually part of the trend line that's now going up the fastest. And, again, what we've generally seen is some version of somewhat double-digit growth pretty consistently with cycling. I had put up there that map that showed kind of the long-term vision of major protected connections between every major destination in the city. We're working our way through that. We are continuing to install bike racks as resources allow. I think there has also been the question of longer term, what we would call secure bike storage for not just a quick trip somewhere, but all day if you're commuting or overnight, as you would see in European and Asian cities. That is definitely a much bigger challenge. What we've seen in other countries with that model is typically it is a governmental entity that puts up quite a bit of capital money up front. In the case of the great biking cities of Europe, and Copenhagen and Amsterdam and Utrecht, or Japanese cities, government entity puts up an enormous sort of capital cost up front. Often a very big facility is built with thousands of spaces, and the operation is typically subsidized. American cities have done small bits of that. There are some transit agencies around the country. BART out in the Bay Area is probably one people would be familiar with, where they have done some linking of more long-term secure bike parking with their transit facilities. But it's definitely a place, I think, where American cities, and I'll admit New York is one of them, have definitely lagged compared to our European counterparts. We are definitely looking into different models. Again, it's a bit of a challenge at the moment because, both us and the MTA, for example, we're facing fiscal difficulties and adding new capital priorities. Again, not that it can't be done, but the question just has to be asked, what will come off the list? I will just flag one thing we are focusing on. A lot of the Port Authority is looking to build a big new bus terminal over on the west side. Likewise, we're looking now at a redesign of Penn Station. Again, as we've seen in those great European cities, when you're designing a big transit facility, that is a wonderful opportunity to include major bike parking, baked right into the design from the start. And that's certainly something we're interested in. And I know we have some advocates in the audience, something we would love your help in pushing for. We think those do present some real opportunities.
Okay, so this is from John Marcos. What are you going to do about biker licenses and the danger to pedestrians? People are tired of near misses due to bikers blowing through red lights, going the wrong way, riding on sidewalks, and not working front, back and lights. 2 pedestrians have been killed by bikers in Central Park and the Upper East Side. Don't more bike lanes increase congestion for cars, trucks, taxis, and ambulances?
So 2 questions there. I'll tackle them both, biker safety and then sort of the congestion question. And I think most folks probably know the city is not the licensing entity. The state, this is true in all the states. The state is the one who licenses drivers and motorcycle riders. there hasn't been, as far as I know, any state that has attempted to license cyclists. And I think that's because, cycling is an activity we sort of start to encourage with young children. I think in most cities, it's an activity they want to encourage. Again, it's environmentally friendly and affordable. And it has sort of seemed impractical to figure out how to do, and I would dare say not particularly politically popular. But as I mentioned earlier, I think it is a fair question about making sure that all of us, I start with motorists, but cyclists too, that we're all engaging in safe behaviors on the road. Again, we work closely with groups like Bike New York and Transportation Alternatives, to talk about making sure that cyclists are doing the right thing. And, the city has tried from time to time, NYPD has been involved in some enforcement efforts. I have to say they have proved wildly unpopular for the most part. So, part of this is really calling on cyclists to obey the traffic rules, just like vehicles do. I would just add one thing, and it was on one of the slides. One of the things we're trying to do to help with compliance overall is what we call in the sort of the traffic engineering business, creating green waves, which is creating a series of lights, traffic signals that are timed for bicycle progressions. Because part of why, admittedly, cyclists often jump red lights is because, unlike a car, when you've got momentum on a bike, it's hard to keep stopping at every intersection. And so for some key bike corridors now, we are experimenting with timing the traffic signals. And they do this in some Scandinavian countries so that bikes get more of a progression of green lights. It makes it more likely that they will obey the signals. We found, in the places we're doing it, it has not had a bad impact on vehicular travel time. So I think we'll do more of that. It will help create more of just a culture of compliance all around. On the second part of the question about congestion, it is no question that
I think the commissioner froze there. See if we can give her a second to come back.
Cars, taxis.
I'm sorry, Commissioner, looks like you're freezing up.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. You were.
We'll give her a couple of seconds, see.
Have you got me now?
Not quite.
Okay. Can you see me now?
We can hear you, but you're still frozen.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll talk and you'll have me frozen, I guess. I think I was just saying, hopefully, I don't know where I got cut off. There's no question now that the competition for street space is buses, trucks, bike lanes. Now we have new forms of mobility, scooters, revels, and now, the huge desire for package deliveries, which was enormous before COVID and is even larger now. And now again, the new creative uses that we're trying to do, restaurants and open streets. And I think from the point of view of the agency that runs the streets, our goal is always to try and accommodate all the users best we can, do it in a way that's safely. But I think we are also trying very much to become a more environmentally sustainable, safer, mass transit friendly city. And that certainly means catering as much as we can to those modes, particularly buses, bikes, and look, there's going to be those challenges of all of us having to share the roads. That will never go away in New York City, but our job, I think, is to try and balance it best we can. Again, leaning into, I think, making our city less auto-dependent.
Okay, great. Let's see if we can get one more in. So with those commuters who are concerned with COVID to fear taking public transportation, and those same commuters who might not be bike adept, the driving culture in New York City looks like it is increasing. How do you, deal with that and foresee that for the foreseeable future until people are more comfortable returning to public transportation? Commissioner, did you?
People are coming.
Okay, I think because of the technical difficulties, I think we'll stop there. What we will do though is for anyone who's asked questions that didn't get answered, we will have that detailed script that we will share with the commissioner and her staff, and they have the opportunity then to respond. Thank you, Commissioner, for that, and I am going to now turn our attention to bring up the President and Dean, Anthony Crowell of New York Law School, to give us closing remarks. Dean Crowell?
Thanks so much, Brian, and thanks so much, Ross, for your extraordinary leadership and vision, especially during this incredibly difficult time for all of us. And Commissioner, it was a total delight to have you today amidst such trouble and challenging circumstances for the city of New York. It is a great thing for us to be able to look to your leadership and to the amazing team that you've assembled at DOT, and feel so confident about the plans to move forward during a very difficult and sustained period of disruption with COVID-19. I think times like these require great leadership, great vision, and a lot of thought and community participation. And I think the level of thought and engagement across the city that DOT has accomplished is quite remarkable. Few people can appreciate how complex the city's transportation network is, what the systems are like, and what it means for everyday people. And those of us who have been in public service can appreciate that. And we appreciate you and what you and your team do. So thank you for your amazing public service. And thank you for being part of the New York Law School community. On a personal note, I just want to offer special congratulations to your new general counsel, Susan Rogerson-Pondish, who was Deputy General Counsel for many, many years and now takes the seat that Phil Damashek recently departed from. And I just want to say congratulations to Susan, and to thank you, Commissioner, for recognizing her extraordinary contributions and leadership in the legal office at DOT.
Well, I hope you can hear me now. Thank you for those kind words, and we are thrilled and blessed to have Susan now at the helm. I think, as you've mentioned, she's an extraordinary leader and visionary in her own right, and will serve the city well.
Absolutely. So thank you all. We appreciate your attendance at today's session, a wonderful level of participation, and we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thanks so much. Bye.